Imagine Rome in the year 218 AD. The empire stretched from the cold moors of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Roads connected thousands of kilometers, markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world, and the legions kept at bay peoples who could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of that machinery of power. Rome seemed eternal, indestructible, master of the destiny of millions. But behind this facade of greatness, the empire also lived through deep tensions, power struggles, senate plots, barracks intrigues, and a society beginning to wonder how far its ambition could go. In the midst of this landscape emerged an unexpected protagonist, a Syrian boy of just 14 years old who, in a matter of months, would shake the very foundations of the most powerful civilization in history. His official name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, but history would remember him forever as Heliogabalus. A youth raised in a religious environment very different from the Roman one, marked by the cult of the sun and Eastern traditions that senators and Roman citizens found strange, even disturbing. And when that teenager reached the imperial purple, he did not merely follow the rules, he shattered them one by one. We are not talking about the petty whims of a capricious emperor. We are talking about a reign turned into a large-scale social and religious experiment. Ceremonies that blended the sacred with the profane, processions where gender roles were inverted, banquets in which the symbols of traditional power were mocked, and a project of transformation that sought to rewrite what it meant to be Roman. But one moment in particular passed into history as the peak of his audacity, the day Heliogabalus gathered 100 men of the Roman aristocracy, ordered them to abandon their masculine togas, to don feminine garments made of silk and precious stones, and to marry each other in public ceremonies organized from the very Palatine. Imagine it, senators, knights, and descendants of ancient patrician families walking through Rome as the protagonists of a spectacle that bewildered the crowd. Some experienced it as liberation, others as humiliation. For some it was sacred, for others an unforgivable offense. Who was this young emperor capable of defying the morality of his age with such audacity? An irresponsible madman, a visionary ahead of his time, or simply a boy with absolute power and no limits? Stay, for this is not a legend invented by political enemies. What you are about to discover is a real episode, documented by chroniclers of his time, one that forces us to ask, how far can a human being go when the power of an empire is concentrated in his hands? What you will hear today is the story of how a teenager turned Rome into the stage of a cultural revolution without precedent. A story about religion, identity, politics, and power, but also about the eternal tension between tradition and change, between what a society is willing to accept and what it fears losing forever. And a warning, this tale will not only reveal secrets of the past, it will also lead you to question how we understand today power, freedom, and diversity. Do not leave, because the best is yet to come. To grasp the magnitude of Heliogabalus's reign, we must first travel to his origins. He was not born in Rome, nor was he educated in the ideals of the Latin aristocracy. His story begins in Emesa, a city in Syria that, at that time, was a crossroads of cultures, Hellenistic, Roman, and Eastern. There, Greco-Roman temples coexisted with local cults that many Romans dismissed as exotic superstitions. Heliogabalus, whose birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, belonged to a family of great prestige in the region. His mother, Julia Soaemias, and his grandmother, Julia Misa, were direct descendants of the powerful Severan dynasty, which gave him a blood connection to the emperors of Rome. His father, Sextus Varius Marcellus, had been a high-ranking Roman official. But what truly marked the boy was not his political lineage, but his spiritual inheritance. From childhood, he was trained as a priest of the sun god Heliogabalus, a divinity worshipped in Emesa. This cult centered around a sacred black stone, symbol of the god, and its rituals were very different from the sober Roman religion. There were chants, dances, brightly colored garments, and practices that celebrated the union of the human with the divine in ways that Romans considered extravagant and even immoral. While in Rome the young elite studied rhetoric, law, and military discipline, Heliogabalus grew immersed in ceremonies full of mysticism, where sensuality and spirituality intertwined. From an early age, he came to see power not as a civic duty, but as an almost religious act. The destiny of this boy changed thanks to the ambition and cunning of his grandmother, Julia Misa. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, the legions were divided, and the Severan dynasty seemed to have reached its end. Julia Misa saw in her grandson the perfect instrument, a youth with imperial blood, charismatic in rituals, and capable of mesmerizing the troops. She convinced the Syrian legions that the teenager was not only a legitimate heir, but the secret son of Caracalla. It was a lie, but a lie so powerful that it became political truth. Thus, at only 14 years old, Heliogabalus was proclaimed emperor by the legions in the east. And with him, Rome did not just receive a new ruler, but the clash of two irreconcilable worlds, the rigid Roman tradition against the exuberant Eastern religiosity. This context is no mere detail. It is the key to understanding why, from the very first day, Heliogabalus ruled differently from all his predecessors. He did not see the throne as a continuation of the Caesars, but as a stage to impose a new vision of the world, where identity, religion, and power fused into a single project. When the legions proclaimed Heliogabalus emperor in the year 218, many in Rome thought he would be another young puppet, controlled by older advisors. They were wrong. From the very moment he began his journey from Syria to the capital, the new Caesar made it clear he would not govern like any of his predecessors. The journey to Rome was not a simple political transfer, it was a procession laden with symbols. Among the riches, soldiers, and courtiers, one object stood out as strange to the Romans, a conical black stone, sacred to the sun god Heliogabalus. That rock was no mere amulet. To Heliogabalus, it was the manifestation of the divine on earth. Its arrival in Rome meant far more than the coronation of an emperor, it heralded the frontal clash between traditional Roman religion and a foreign god that now sought to impose itself at the heart of the empire. During the stops in Antioch, Nicomedia, and other cities along the way, Heliogabalus organized ceremonies that left spectators stunned. Dressed in silk tunics embroidered with gold, he danced in honor of the sun, accompanied by oriental musicians, exotic perfumes, and chants in languages the Roman soldiers could barely understand. It was a spectacle both fascinating and disturbing. Chroniclers note that the legionaries, though bewildered, could not look away. The young emperor radiated a singular magnetism, halfway between priest and monarch, between divinity and man. Wherever he passed, he left the impression that Rome was on the verge of witnessing something never seen before. When he finally entered the Eternal City in the summer of 219, the contrast was absolute. Rome was used to emperors who, despite their eccentricities, respected tradition, the toga, sacrifices to Jupiter, the solemn protocol of the Senate. Heliogabalus shattered those expectations from the very first day. His first great decision was a direct challenge to the gods of Rome. He ordered the construction of a majestic temple in honor of Heliogabalus on the Palatine Hill, right across from the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the supreme deity of Roman tradition. It was not just architecture, it was a political and spiritual message. The boy from Syria was placing his god above the ancestral deities of Rome. For the Senate and the aristocracy, this was heresy. For the common people, it was a fascinating spectacle. And for Heliogabalus himself, it was only the beginning of a reign remembered not for prudence, but for audacity. The cultural clash had begun. Once settled in Rome, Heliogabalus wasted no time showing that his reign would be anything but conventional. Previous emperors had been cruel, eccentric, or indulgent in luxury, but none had dared to reconfigure the very fabric of Roman society. Heliogabalus did. In his religious ceremonies, the city witnessed a spectacle never seen before, senators dressed in tunics embroidered with bright colors, forced to perform dances that Roman culture reserved exclusively for women, matrons of the aristocracy occupying places of honor once reserved for men, processions where the social hierarchy was inverted and plebeians were treated as honored guests while nobles were relegated to secondary roles. Rome, accustomed to a sober and solemn religiosity, now faced a carnival of symbols. What for the Romans was transgression, for Heliogabalus was revelation. He saw no boundaries between political and spiritual power. To him, being emperor also meant being high priest of a new order that celebrated fluidity, blending, and the breaking of barriers between male and female, divine and human, high and low. The imperial banquets became stages of social experimentation. Where once rigidly protocolized dinners had been held, now feasts were organized in which the roles of host and guest blurred. There were tables where slaves occupied seats of honor while senators were reduced to serving them. Amid cups of wine and oriental delicacies, the emperor delivered a direct message: Rome's social order was not eternal, it could be reinvented. Hostile chroniclers branded him a degenerate, but behind those accusations lay an undeniable fact: Heliogabalus was forcing Rome to confront a possibility it had never wished to accept, that identity could be flexible, that power did not have to rest on the same old hierarchies, that even the sacred could take on new forms. The inevitable question took root in everyone's mind: was Rome witnessing an act of imperial madness, or the birth of a cultural revolution? Far from softening his customs in the face of criticism, Heliogabalus pushed them further. And with each ceremony, each banquet, each provocation, he laid the groundwork for his most famous and radical act, the weddings of the 100. The year was 221 AD. Rome had seen coronations, military triumphs, bloody games in the Colosseum, and banquets that defied imagination, but nothing could prepare it for what Heliogabalus was about to stage. The young emperor announced that he would celebrate a series of ceremonies in honor of the solar god Heliogabalus. Up to that point, nothing seemed unusual. Rome was accustomed to religious festivals, though those of this emperor always carried a trace of extravagance. But soon it became clear that this time there would be something different, something never seen before. 100 men of Rome's elite would be the protagonists of a ritual that would break with every ancestral custom. The selection was not random. Senators, knights, and descendants of patrician families received imperial invitations written on purple parchment in golden ink. To refuse such a summons was tantamount to a sentence of treason. Everyone understood this was not a choice but an order disguised as an honor. For weeks, the Palatine was transformed into a workshop of creation. Syrian, Persian, and even Indian artisans were summoned to design garments no Roman had ever seen: silk tunics in brilliant tones, embroidered with solar and lunar symbols, adorned with pearls, gems, and golden ribbons. They were not simply adapted women's clothes, but a new genre of attire, conceived to erase the boundaries between male and female. The preparation was not merely aesthetic. Heliogabalus organized sessions of spiritual instruction. Participants were introduced to a discourse that blended Stoic philosophy, Oriental mysticism, and rituals of the solar cult. They were told they must transcend human limitations, abandon the shackles of rigid identity, and become living reflections of divinity. Some embraced it enthusiastically, others did so trembling, aware that public humiliation awaited them. And then the appointed day arrived, March 15th of the year 221, a date loaded with symbolism, for it coincided with the festival of Anna Perenna, a goddess associated with renewal. At dawn, the augurs interpreted the clear skies as a sign of divine approval. The 100 men were transformed. After ritual baths, makeup, and elaborate hairstyles with braids and pearls, they emerged unrecognizable. Senators who the day before had proudly worn their white togas now appeared like figures out of an oriental mural, turned into hybrids between warriors and priestesses. The opening procession was an unprecedented spectacle. 100 aristocrats paraded through the gardens of the Palatine toward an atrium adorned with purple and golden tapestries, exotic flowers, and oriental perfumes. Musicians dressed in shimmering tunics played strange melodies, foreign to Latin tradition. The audience, a crowd that included senators, plebeians, freedmen, and merchants, watched in stunned silence. Some wept, others laughed in disbelief, many remained paralyzed by the sheer scale of the spectacle. Heliogabalus appeared in the midst of the cortege, dressed in a tunic that blended imperial insignia with oriental ornaments. More than an emperor, he seemed like a high priest of a new god. With a solemn voice, he presided over the wedding ceremonies. These were not conventional marriages. The pairings had been carefully arranged to challenge every structure: senators with knights, patricians with wealthy plebeians, unions that crossed barriers of class as well as gender. The vows were spoken, not before the traditional gods of Rome, but before Heliogabalus, the solar deity that now presided over imperial life. The aristocracy, which for centuries had dictated the rules of honor and virtue, was forced to publicly accept a new order that shattered its deepest values. The impact was immediate. For some, it was liberating. They discovered in the experience a strange sense of freedom, as if they could finally explore hidden aspects of themselves. Others lived it as a nightmare, a public humiliation that eroded their identity and the dignity of their families. What is certain is that the whole of Rome witnessed a day that no chronicler could forget. With a single act, Heliogabalus had shown that absolute power could not only rule territories or armies, but also shape the very identity of those who lived under his authority. That day, the Roman Empire ceased to be simply the greatest military power of the ancient world. For a few hours, it became the stage for the boldest cultural revolution ever attempted in antiquity. The ceremonies of the Weddings of the Hundred did not fade away the next day. On the contrary, the echo of what had happened spread like an earthquake throughout Rome and, soon after, across the rest of the empire. In the Senate, bewilderment mingled with outrage. Many senators had been forced to take part in the ceremony or had relatives among the participants. For them, what had occurred was not only a personal affront, but a threat to the values that sustained the Republic, at least in spirit, and the dignity of Rome. The most conservative spoke of sacrilege, of a crime against ancestral customs. Others, more pragmatic, warned that to oppose the emperor openly was to seek death. Silence and hypocrisy became the only possible defenses. In aristocratic families, the crisis was even more personal. Wives, mothers, and children saw their relatives return transformed, wearing makeup, with the fresh memory of having been forced to play roles that Roman society considered unworthy of a free man. Some families tried to erase the episode as if it had never happened. Others, more progressive, began to wonder whether, in private, that ritual had not revealed a new way of understanding identity. The people of Rome, who had witnessed the spectacle en masse, were divided. Some saw it as a grotesque mockery that discredited the empire before the traditional gods. Others, especially in the popular neighborhoods accustomed to extravagant entertainments, experienced it as a fascinating performance that fueled gossip and conversation for months. Outside the capital, the eastern provinces received the news with less scandal. There, religious traditions involving gender fluidity and the blending of the divine with the human had precedence. For many in Syria or Asia Minor, what Heliogabalus had done was strange, but not incomprehensible. In contrast, in the western provinces, especially in Italy and Hispania, the reactions were of horror. Veteran generals wondered how the empire could maintain its prestige among barbarian peoples if its emperor ridiculed the symbols of Roman manhood. The army began to grow uneasy. The legions could tolerate an eccentric emperor, as long as he guaranteed victories and discipline. But what they saw in Heliogabalus was a ruler more interested in cultural revolutions than in military campaigns. The Praetorians, tasked with his security, began to question how far they could continue protecting a leader who endangered the stability of the empire. The psychological impact on the participants themselves was profound. Some found in the experience an unexpected liberation and began to incorporate feminine elements into their daily lives. Others, on the contrary, fell into identity crises that drew them away from public life or drove them into solitude. The episode was not only political, it was a wound in the soul of Rome. With each ceremony, with each provocation, Heliogabalus seemed to push the empire toward a dangerous frontier. And if anything was becoming clear, it was that the young emperor's enemies would not take long to organize. The audacity of Heliogabalus had brought Rome to the brink. What for him was a transformative spiritual and social vision had become, for senators, generals, and guardians of tradition, an existential threat. The aristocracy was humiliated, the Senate divided, and the army was beginning to lose patience. The young emperor seemed not to notice. He continued planning new ceremonies, new reforms, new challenges to the most sacred norms. For conservative Romans, each of his acts was an affront that corroded the dignitas of the empire. For the Praetorians, tasked with protecting him, each day with Heliogabalus on the throne was a greater risk to their own security and prestige. The tension reached its peak in the year 222. The emperor's own family, which had orchestrated his rise, began to conspire against him. His grandmother, Julia Misa, the same woman who had placed him on the throne by manipulating the legions, understood that her grandson's experiment had become unsustainable. She feared that, if things continued, the Severan dynasty would collapse, and with it her family's power. The plan was cold and calculated. Julia Misa diverted the support of the Praetorian Guard to her other grandson, Alexander Severus, a much more docile young man, presented as the conservative and respectable alternative that Rome needed. Heliogabalus's fate was sealed. On March 11, 222, the Praetorians ambushed him. He was barely 18 years old. The same absolute power that had allowed him to defy all of Rome could not save him from the blade of palace intrigue. He was killed alongside his mother in a conspiracy that combined political ambition with cultural vengeance. The young emperor's corpse was dragged through the streets of the city amid insults and spittle, and finally thrown into the Tiber River, a fate reserved for criminals and traitors. The Senate decreed a damnatio memoriae against him, condemning his memory to oblivion, erasing his name from inscriptions, destroying his statues, and acting as if he had never existed. But, ironically, that condemnation failed to remove him from history. The intensity of his reign, the unusual nature of his ceremonies, and the radicalism of his actions had left too deep a mark. Attempts to erase his memory only made his figure grow more legendary over time. Thus ended the life of a teenage emperor who had dared to challenge all of Rome. His fall was brutal, but his shadow would continue to haunt the corridors of history for centuries. After his death, Rome tried to erase Heliogabalus from history. His name was condemned, his images destroyed, his reforms abolished. Yet his memory never fully disappeared. Not even damnatio memoriae could extinguish the impact of an emperor who, in just 4 years of reign, had turned the most powerful empire in the world upside down. Today, almost 2,000 years later, his figure still sparks passionate debate. For some historians, Heliogabalus was the perfect example of the dangers of absolute power, a young man without limits who confused his desires with the destiny of an entire civilization. For others, he was a visionary ahead of his time, someone who dared to challenge rigid notions of gender, sexuality, and religion in a hierarchically structured world. The truth is that, beyond moral judgments, his story tells us a universal truth: power has the capacity to transform societies, but it can also destroy them when it knows no limits. Heliogabalus was an extreme mirror of that paradox. And perhaps the most fascinating thing is how this episode, which occurred nearly 2 millennia ago, continues to resonate with our present. His ceremonies, his breaks with tradition, his provocations raise questions that still echo today. How far can a society go in its ability to reinvent itself? Where do we draw the line between individual freedom and collective stability? Was Heliogabalus a reckless madman, or a misunderstood pioneer? Rome tried to silence his voice, but his story refused to be muted. And by remembering him, we discover that diversity, rebellion, and the desire to transform the world are not modern phenomena, they have accompanied humanity from the very beginning. If this story surprised you, share this video so more people can learn about one of Rome's most enigmatic emperors. And leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of Heliogabalus? An irresponsible tyrant, a revolutionary visionary, or something more complex? This was just one chapter of the best-kept secrets of the ancient world. Subscribe to discover more stories that, like this one, remind us that the past never stops speaking to us.